Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on strengthening trade and transportation networks for long-term prosperity. I'm Ryan Greer, our Senior Director of Transportation and Infrastructure Policy at the Chamber, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this discussion today. And I'm very pleased with the two panelists we have for the webinar. The first, I'm really pleased to have the President and CEO of Campotex, Gord McKenzie, joining us. Gord and Canpotex have generously helped make this webinar possible, and we'd like to also thank them very much for their support of this webinar. You all know our President and CEO, Perrin Beatty. He is an officer of the Order of Canada, the head of not just the Canadian Chamber. In past lives, he was the head of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, and also the CBC. He is former cabinet minister of many portfolios, and really thankful to have Perrin on with us today. Gord McKenzie is the president and CEO of Campotex. He was appointed to the role in January of 2020. Prior to that, he worked at the Mosaic Company and had been there since its inception in 2004. Most recently, he was the vice president of global sales, responsible for global phosphate in North American potash sales and marketing. Gord has also held numerous sales, marketing, and management positions within Cargill. He hails originally from Brandon. He went to school at the University of Manitoba, and as recently as 2013 became a graduate of the Harvard School of Harvard Business School. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us and being here today.
Thank you.
So I've got a whole bunch of questions to ask both of you, and I'm sure our audience members do as well. For those that have just joined us in the last minute or two, you can ask questions of Perrin and Gord through the Slido app. On the webinar, the Slido address is popping up. You can populate your questions there, as well as vote on questions that other people have asked. And we're halfway through our session. I will turn to that. But before I get to my questions, I thought it might be useful just to give our a couple of minutes for any opening remarks or thoughts that they wanted to share before we get into it. So why don't we go to you first, Gord?
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you, Perrin, as well, and to the Chamber. Thank you very much for hosting this great event. I'm happy to be here today and join so many people from across the country in this new digital format. I'm here in sunny Saskatoon. Glorious fall, maybe even winter day here, but it is sunny, and it's great to bring everybody together in this forum. Certainly for us here at Campotex, transportation is a vital topic for us, and in particular for our long-term prosperity and Canadian prosperity, transportation is critically important. So I'm super pleased to be here today and to share some views on the strengthening and how we strengthen this sector. But maybe before I say a few things about that, a little more on my introduction. Thank you, Ryan, for providing that. But as you mentioned, I did join Campotex just recently, in January of 2020, as president and CEO. So it seems amazing how many months it's been. It hasn't been that long, but as we can all attest, 2020 has been quite the year to make a job change and a career here in Saskatoon. So that said, it seems like a long time. It's been a really fun experience here at Campotex that I'm enjoying. Maybe a little bit as well about Campotex. First and foremost, I'm super proud to say we're Canada's potash company. We're Canada's largest supplier of potash to our overseas markets, and you probably are aware of our shareholders, but Mosaic and Nutrien, we market and deliver their Saskatchewan potash, a valuable fertilizer nutrient, to markets all over the world, our customers all over the world, to help grow food. So we're in the food business. Each year, we're marketing over 12 million tons of potash to over 40 markets and over 100 customers around the world. So truly a global business. Campotex has been around a long time. 1972 will mark 50 years for Campotex, and over those many years, those decades, we've grown to be one of Canada's largest exporters to those markets that I referenced. In particular, our big 5 markets that we serve today as Canpotex: Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia. Those are our big 5. And just for reference, Brazil, obviously a big market, a big importing market. We represent 60% of all their imports from Canada with Canpotex potash. So as you can imagine, this topic and our discussion today is really around supply chain and logistics and how important that is. And when you're moving over 12 million tons a year to our export markets that I referenced, it's not easy, especially when we're sitting here in the middle of Canada and Saskatchewan. And it's something that we've excelled at, that we've grown into, that we continue to focus on. We continue to strive to get better, more consistent, reliable. And it takes investment, not just from Canpotex, but from the country and our partners. And as you can imagine, Canpotex, over the years, we've invested over $1 billion in our supply chain. Just a few things to reference. We have over 5,000 of our own rail cars that are actually made and built here in Canada, a National Steel rail car in Hamilton. We maintain those cars for safety at our maintenance facility near Lanigan here in Saskatchewan. And we have 3 state-of-the-art terminals to serve our customers in Vancouver, Portland, and St. John, New Brunswick as well. Putting it all together, what's 12 million tons of potash mean moving from Saskatchewan to our customers all over the world? It's a big deal. Not only rail cars to the port that I mentioned, but we have on an average year over 240 vessels that we're loading, making over 700 port stops around the world. And if you look any given day, today, for example, we have 25 vessels on the water headed to our customers around the world. So with that, supply chain is critically important, our infrastructure critically important, and we try to control as much of that as we possibly can as Canpotex. But for the most part, we have our facilities, we load our rail cars, but the power and the crews to pull the rail cars are really, we rely on our partners, CP Rail, CN Rail, to do that for us and deliver to our terminals. And I touch on some of these points about our supply chain, our own investment, because quite honestly, our competitive advantage as Canada's potash company is being consistent and reliable, delivering on time, meeting the expectations of our customers are critically important. And I can't underscore the point enough that potash sector is competitive. And we have competitors around the world, namely the Russians, the Belarusians, that they're trying to beat us every day at what we do. And if we let our customers down, if we let our guard down, there will be somebody on our front door, on our customer's front door, trying to replace us. So we have to be very careful and consistent with our supply chain, reinforcing the consistency, the reliability that we offer. Now, I know we will probably touch, Ryan, on COVID and the market and what that's done to us in the current scenario. But I just want to make a couple points that post a COVID world, for us to successfully navigate, we're going to need to really have our supply chain come through for us. Again, being consistent, reliable, safe. And we've been fortunate through COVID that our business, agriculture, potash, food, essential service. So we've been fortunate. I know much more fortunate than many other industries. So we thank our lucky stars for that. But I also don't want to get complacent within that and how fortunate we've been, and that even other markets outside of Canada has put a huge priority on food security and receiving our products and potash. But it's so important. Potash to Canada, it's the second most valuable mineral in Canada, only behind gold. So we're right up there for importance. And the total freight in Canada from potash and Canpotex is about 50% to our business. And our sector for Canada presents about $5.5 billion to the Canadian GDP. So it's a big sector. It's an important sector. I'm proud to be here at Canpotex and leading this team and delivering to our customers around the world. We just can't get complacent. We can't let future disruptions impact our transportation system in years like this. And it's not just COVID. We'll touch on a few other points, but of course, being here in Saskatchewan, we deal with the cold weather, the winters every year. This past year, we've had some labor disruptions, we've had some blockades, we've had landslides due to weather. So it's all the more important that we continue to raise the importance of our supply chain, our transportation and execution, so that we can deliver on our promise of being consistent, reliable, and delivering our great product to our customers around the world.
Great.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks so much, Gordon. And you've introduced a number of threads that I'm going to pull on here in a few minutes. But maybe first, just to turn it over to you briefly, Perrin, for sort of any introductory remarks or thoughts that you wanted to share with the group.
Ryan, thanks very much, and welcome everybody. We're absolutely delighted to have you on the call today, and I'm very pleased, Gord, to be able to be on this with you. Every CEO wants to be at the center of things and wants to see action. You certainly couldn't have chosen a better way of starting the year than to come to Canpotex just before the rail blockades and COVID-19. I'm assuming this has not been a dull year for you, and I expect this is going to continue for a while.
No question. It's been fun too, though, Perrin. It's a lot of challenges, a lot of unforeseen issues, but it's been a lot of fun.
The wonderful thing is feeling as if you're making a difference on something that really counts, and during all of this, you certainly are. Ryan, the point that I would make simply at the beginning here is that we were reminded very forcefully this year by the rail blockades, first of all, and then secondly by COVID, about the importance of our supply chains and about logistics, how critical they are to the well-being of every Canadian, and certainly how essential they are to the economy itself. We'll perhaps have a chance to come back to this in the question and answer period, but what the rail blockade showed was the vulnerability of the system. What COVID has shown, surprisingly, is the resilience of the system. I think many of us have been surprised to discover how well global supply chains have worked and how well domestic supply chains have worked within Canada over the course of COVID-19. But it really, one of the things we should be looking at is what are the lessons we can learn from all of this. One of them is we're looking at recovery is that we need to focus with a laser-like focus on the issue of how we ensure the resilience of our supply chains and what sort of lessons we take out of COVID-19 in terms of policy and in terms of investments that we make to ensure that Canadians, as other crises develop in the future, have a resilient and dependable supply chain system that we can count on, both to source the products that we need, but also to be able to get Canadian products to market as well. So we'll perhaps have a chance to talk about that in greater detail over the course of the next several minutes. Why don't I leave it at that, and let's get into the discussion.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. And before we get into the question, just one more reminder for everybody listening in. If you want to ask a question of Gord or Perrin, you can do so via Slido on your browser, on your phone. Just type in www.sli.do. And then the meeting code is 2393, and you can ask any questions through there, and I'm going to turn to those in about 15 or 20 minutes. You both mentioned the blockades. It's pretty remarkable that this was, arguably one of the biggest supply chain crises in recent Canadian history. It happened earlier this year, and it feels like it was years ago. Everything else we've been through since. But this was a real challenge for certainly all of our members of the Canadian Chamber, certainly for companies like yours, Gord, and the customers of everyone. Let's start there, Gord. Maybe you could just give us a bit of a feel for how the blockades themselves impacted Canpotex, what communication with your customers were like, and how the organization managed its way through that crisis.
Sure, Ryan. Thank you. And you're right. It's amazing. That was a major issue for us in our business at the time. And way back in early 2020, little did we know the challenges that 2020 would bring with other things beyond just the blockades. And the COVID-19 pandemic and weather issues and other derailments and issues that we face on a daily basis. But you know, I touched on it in my opening comments that we're in Saskatchewan and we're mining our great product and shipping it to customers around the world. And we've been around a long time developing relationships and being the brand of Canada's product, delivering reliably, consistently. So we don't have a lot of room for error when there's disruptions to our supply chain, such as the blockade that you mentioned. So, and we also don't have a lot of optionality. We have a few ports, a few different directions to go, but we're landlocked and we need to get to port consistently and reliably. And I guess the biggest challenge, Ryan, is when we face something like a blockade, if it slows us down even by a day or two, that we've got vessels lined up, vessels waiting that are set to deliver our product around the world. Anytime that there are disruptions, that hits our consistency, our reliability, and the brand that we project to our customers. And if we're not there, if we're not delivering, then, as I mentioned, our competitors from Russia and Belarus would love to slide in and be that reliable supplier. So it was certainly challenging, something that we worked through early in the year and really needs support. We just can't shut down the infrastructure of our supply chain and our transportation system in Canada when you only have so many options. So it seems like a world ago when that was happening in January, February, but it had a major impact, as well as, you know, the weather every year causes us to have some disruptions as well.
On the same issue, Perrin, you know, certainly we heard about, you know, the fact, and you alluded to this in your remarks, that this impacted, you know, all of our membership and certainly all Canadians in a variety of different ways. What would be your sense about how well prepared Canada is, our governments and the private sector as well, to handle another situation like this in the future? Do you have any confidence that Canada is any better positioned to handle a blockade? I mean, I certainly don't know if there's any guarantee that this isn't, you know, hasn't been now tried and tested and proven as a potential way for various organizations to try to get the government's attention. What's your feeling on sort of how prepared Canada is for something like this if it happens again in the near term?
Ryan, I'm very concerned about it. One of the lessons that people got, this was a political action by a variety of groups. You know, it wasn't simply with regard to a pipeline. All sorts of groups got involved and tacked their own agendas onto the particular protest. And what it demonstrated is the vulnerability of Canada's transportation system to determine groups who want to deprive Canadians of services. And it was serious. The impact on business was serious in terms of the potential of moving goods to be able to get them to market. Gord highlighted the importance of our being a reliable partner, a reliable supplier, and it damages your reputation globally if you're not able to do that. It also meant that in many instances people had difficulty getting the inputs that they needed for their business. Plus, there were public health issues. For example, the shortage of propane into the eastern part of the country put people in rural areas, people in seniors' residences, in many instances, in potential danger. So the impact of severing the transportation system, the logistics chain, is major. The concern that I have is that it sent a message to groups looking to hold the public to ransom that there is a vulnerability in the transportation system that can be used by attacking any pressure point along the way. It was interesting to note that in this instance, it was rail transportation that was focused on. It could just as easily have been airports which were being hit, or or ports, or other parts of the system. And the message is very clear to governments. This is critical to us. This is the nervous system of the country, and we have to ensure that it's maintained and protected, or else we put ourselves at very serious jeopardy, not just economically, but in terms of public health and safety as well. So have the lessons been fully learned? I don't know. I hope so, because there's certainly apparent for everybody to see that we simply can't afford as a country to leave ourselves hostage to this sort of event in the future.
I would just add, Ryan, I agree with Perrin's comments. And at the end of the day, it's our reputation at risk here, and our reputation matters, and it's the brand that we've built with our customers around the world. And any disruption to this reliability and delivering on our promises impacts your reputation. And and our optionality is fairly limited to get product to port. So it's critically important that we keep those lanes open and moving, because we're moving. Rail cars, as an example, our trains are 205 car long. It would take over 1,000 trucks to replace one train. So you can imagine, logistically traveling through winter, those challenges, the safety of things, 1,000 trucks to Vancouver from Saskatchewan versus one unit train. So it's a big deal, and it's critically important to our competitive advantage as a supplier in this important industry.
Ryan, I might just add to that as well, that this was domestic action political action by domestic groups in Canada. The other area where we have a vulnerability is obviously to cyber terrorism and through acts by international players. And again, this should be a wake-up call for us that we need to work together, the private sector and government, to ensure that we harden our systems, and it's not possible for somebody who's hostile to Canada to be able to grind our transportation system to a halt.
Great, thank you both. So Gord, you start in January 2020. You're dealing with the usual winter disruptions and challenges. That's immediately followed by the rail blockades, and then we barely caught our breath following that, and we the global health crisis. It's becoming quite clear, or it has been clear for some time, that we are going to be stuck in the economic crises that has accompanied the health crises for some time, until there are widely distributed vaccines available. I guess I'm just wondering, as a global logistics company, what has Canpotex observed around how other countries are managing both the economic, and if you're comfortable commenting on the health disruptions brought on by COVID, and what's your sense of where Canada fits in all that, and how we're managing as a country?
Thank you, Ryan. And no question that the dominant topic for 2020 is COVID-19 and how we've responded as a country in Canada, as well as every country. Nobody's been immune to the global pandemic, of course. It's funny, just as I think back and how things unfolded early in the year, because we do a lot of business with China. And China, of course, was the first where it was developing, and never envisioned that it would advance to the way that it has here globally. But we were working early with our customers in China in January and February, and having the discussions, understanding how can we help, and learning. Didn't dream that it would expand to the level that it has. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, COVID, we've fared reasonably well. We've been challenged by it, but I'm thankful that our business has been essential. It's been deemed that way, and we've had our shareholders at Mosaic and Nutrien have operated their mines and operations safely to produce the product that we need to ship. And our supply chain has had a priority, shipping to ports. And naturally, if you think about it, when we load our vessels, there's at least a 14-day sailing time to every market that we serve, because maybe in case those on the line didn't realize it, Canpotex, we don't serve North America. We serve every market but North America. So our customers are global around the world. And that actually was a partial benefit within COVID, that we were able to self-isolate, so to speak, or quarantine during the sailing time, which helped. Now, you asked about other countries. Certainly this has been a priority and an issue for every country, and there's been some impact, no question, to their supply chains and their access to labor and safe people when vessels are arriving and unloading. There's been some challenges and some delays there, but for the most part, agriculture has been a priority globally. Food has been a priority globally. food security, critically important. So it's safety. We're never going to compromise that. That's first and foremost, safety first. And thankfully, with our technology and our innovation here in Canada, we've been able to work fairly well remotely, many of us from home, and execute and continue the business, and relatively minor disruptions from that regard. And our customers too. I can tell you, I have several negotiations with customers, and one of the first ones was with the China market. Who would have dreamed we'd be in a call like this with nine or more faces on the screen with translations, and we adapted. You had to be quick. You had to be agile. You had to basically work with what we had and focus on what we could to help deliver such an important product to our customers around the world.
Thanks. A quick follow-up, and I'm actually just, you've sort of answered this, but one of the questions that's popped up on Slido here is, has COVID directly resulted in any sort of new international opportunities for Canpotex? Have you seen it affect any of your competitors in any substantive way, or have they sort of adapted pretty quickly like you have? And has it impacted your export markets in any substantive way?
It's a great question. And again, fortunately, we've been quite pleased that our volumes in 2020 actually are maybe even slightly better than anticipated at the start of the year. So we're thankful that food security has been so important and that our customers continue to demand our product. And I will say, economically, we've been challenged. Certainly the first 4 or 5 months of the year, there was a lot of pressure on price for potash. And was that related to COVID? It certainly was related partially to the uncertainty in the world. What impact would this have on the economy? Restaurants shutting down, food services shutting down globally, but people still needed to eat. They were just eating from home. And so we were thankful that the priority and the affordability and commodity prices that help drive the profitability and consumption of our products remained strong through COVID-19. And so that side has been, I will say, surprisingly good, and thankful and fortunate for that. The other, I guess, part to that question, Ryan, was whether our other competitors had similar benefits. And it's a global market, so they're trying to serve the same demand that we compete heavily on. And I'd say we haven't seen, at least from COVID, disruptions from our competitors. I kept watching to see, because so many countries took different tactics on how they dealt with the pandemic, as you well know, versus Canada. And Canada has done really quite an exceptional job overall. In other countries, like our biggest competitors, Russia and Belarus, they had a different view on maybe how hard to handle the pandemic. And it hasn't, that I don't believe has significantly impacted their supply nor their supply chain. And with demand good, we're competing against each other to serve that demand. And I guess that's where I'd leave it, Ryan.
Thanks, Gord. Okay, let's explore that a little more with you, Perrin. As we've alluded to, there's any number of factors that determine sort of Canada's relative competitiveness, whether it's for Canpotex or any other of our members. But certainly our ability to manage the pandemic is, probably having a greater impact than almost any other factor in this moment, and will again for the foreseeable future. Specifically on supply chains, but even more broadly, what do you and what does the Chamber see as necessary for our businesses to continue to operate, especially as we see an uptick of cases here in various parts of the country, so that our firms can continue to operate effectively, not just in international markets, but national, regional, and even local economies.
Ryan, we're dealing with two unprecedented crises in our lifetime. The first is obviously the public health crisis that is posed by COVID-19. The other is obviously the threat to our economic health. And what we were looking for from government when the speech from the throne came down was a very clear focus on managing these two twin crises, these two interrelated crises. We wanted two things. The first was a national strategy, a national COVID strategy, which was integrated, which was, up until now, we've been treating the symptoms of the pandemic rather than managing the pandemic itself. And as a result, then we've been responsive always. We see an uptick, we shut things down. We see a problem cropping up somewhere else. The government might write a subsidy check, but we haven't been managing the disease. And when you look at where we are at this point, it is likely that we're going to have to be dealing with this killer in our midst for the next year until there's a widely disseminated vaccine. We won't even know what the so-called new normal looks like until then. This has serious impacts both socially and economically. And my strong view is that it's not sustainable, either socially or economically, for us to keep Canadians in a medically induced coma over the course of the next year. So we need a different strategy. It's one that starts with the recognition that the disease is deadly and has to be taken seriously, and all of us have to do our part, but that we need to be strategic about how we do it, that we need to target in particular the areas of highest risk to reduce the level of risk in the same way as we manage the threat along the 49th parallel from terrorism, use a risk management approach. In addition to that, we need to build resilience into the system so that if there is an outbreak, if it gets worse, that we don't have to shut everything down again, that we're able still to manage. And we're in a much better position to do that now than we were before because we know so much more about the disease, how it's spread, how it isn't. We have PPEs, we have protocols, we have other means of dealing with it. So the first thing was a national COVID strategy. The second was a coherent economic strategy. And we need to see, as soon as possible, a mini budget. We very shortly will be into the longest period that we've gone in Canada without a federal budget. And the answer that governments give is they say there's so much unpredictability that it's not possible for government to budget at this point because they don't know what to expect. But Canpotex and every business that's online here has to budget. And they recognize as they develop their budgets, they may have to revisit them over the course of the year and make course corrections. That job is made an awful lot easier if you know what the assumptions are that the government's making for economic policy, for interest rates, for spending, for taxation, for investment, for how the disease itself is going to function. And so we need to see an economic strategy as well, one that's coherent. And then finally, we need in Canada much better coordination than we have. In my home province of Ontario 2 weeks ago, if you wanted to plan your Thanksgiving dinner, it was very hard to get coherent information as to who you could have at the table. It varied from government to government and from municipality to municipality. And it is very hard for business to plan if there isn't coherence in terms of how the authorities are managing the crisis.
Great, thanks, Perrin. And yeah, I'm struck by your Thanksgiving example. It's remarkable, when officials or even at a cabinet meeting, the distinction between a rule and a guideline can be obvious to somebody who designs them for a living. A rule is enforced by law, and a guideline is a recommendation. But you try explaining that during a news conference when people just want to be told what to do, and you're told what you can't do and what you should do, and then there's a whole sort of mushy middle between jurisdiction. It leads to undoubtedly a lot of confusion.
Well, you look, Ryan, at a business that is at a national retailer doing business across the country that wants to have standard training for all its employees, wants to have standard PPEs available, standard protocols in all of their stores, and they find that in every municipality that they go into, the regulations are different. It makes it exceptionally difficult to manage as a result.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, Gord, back to you on sort of international supply chains. Obviously the pandemic is going to result in some changes, some temporary, others permanent to international supply chains. For a business like yours, I would imagine those are less severe than, manufacturing, where supply chains and those in the components business may look to move operations around in a way that they can help secure their own resilience in the event of future events like this. But I'm just curious as to what you see some of the changes, either what you've seen and what they are, what they may be as a result of COVID. And then we can sort of expand on that. I'd be interested in both your thoughts on sort of what Canada needs to think about doing now to make sure that it's sort of full participants, but also benefiting from any shifts that are happening in these supply chains.
Fair. Another good question, Ryan. I guess that's why you're the moderator. I like it, very relevant. But I will say it's too soon for a prediction on some of the changes globally. I mentioned already, we're already getting used to the virtual environment. And again, I'm thankful, Canpotex, 48 years in business, long-standing customer relationships. All our customers are outside of Canada, outside of North America, that we have strong relationships to begin with. That gives us a competitive advantage. But we have moved to a virtual environment. And I talked about some major negotiations with the Chinese. We've done it with others, where we're doing it video conference, and so travel will always be a big part of Canpotex and who we are. We like the connection and the face-to-face interaction with our customers to really get to know their business and understand it. But we will certainly be more efficient in how we do that, and we've had to do that. We've had to do that the last 7-8 months, and we've been fortunate that it's gone quite well. We're also taking that to the supply chain side of things. I talked about some of our rail cars and some of our new rail cars. We've got over 5,000 in our fleet, but we're in the process of adding some right now that'll be ready this fall. And we're going through now virtual reviews of those rail cars when they're delivered versus the old in person. So it's changing the way we do things. And I think many on the line will understand when I say you need to be agile, you need to be flexible, and you need to look for solutions to your problems, because there's going to be problems. You just never know exactly what those may be, whether it's COVID, whether it's winter, whether it's a derailment, a fire, you name it. There's always something that pops up. And so you have to be flexible and agile. And I think the more you can invest in optionality for your business and your supply chain is important, but also innovation and keep improving how you do things. And we are learning from this experience in COVID-19. Not all has been negative. We're getting some best practices, and we're learning to apply to our business to make us better next year. And whether it's with your employees, whether it's the future of work, I know there may be some questions on that. We're learning a lot through this pandemic, and some of it is positive.
Perrin, why don't we turn to you on that question as well, around the way that the work is changing. I think for certainly for the Chamber and many of our largest members, the temporary pause in business travel was something that was manageable over the short term and over the summer. Was becoming increasingly less so as companies need to find ways beyond just the virtual setting to do face-to-face business. And obviously there's a network component that many, including us, are still trying to figure out on these virtual platforms. And if I had to hazard a guess through forums like this, I would bet that, Perrin, you've been recorded more in the last 6 months doing these types of things than you've been recorded in your life up to this year. What have you seen and heard from Chamber members on sort of the virtual connectivity, the future of work, the necessity of business travel, and that?
To put it in a phrase, that the world has changed and we're not going back. There's not a single CEO that I've spoken to during the course of the last half a year who has said that the company is going to look the same afterward as it did before all of this happened. And as Gord mentioned, there's lots that's bad about COVID, but there are also lessons that we've learned that have been very positive as well. The technology that we're using here, Ryan, I don't have to tell you, we've had in place in the Chamber for the last 2 or 3 years. We just didn't use it extensively until after COVID struck. We're not going to go back to the way that we did business before. We're going to do it differently. We'll use these digital technologies more effectively. We have our AGM next week rather. we are able to bring more people into the AGM virtually than ever we could in person, and we're able to reach out around the world to speakers from anywhere to bring them into our AGM. We want to incorporate this sort of ability in the future. So every institution is reinventing itself. That includes the chamber and includes all of our members. And we're going to be much more digital than we were before. We're going to be much more creative and innovative. We will use distributed work much more than has been the case up until now. But it means as well that we as a country need to have a strategy, because our trading competitors are very focused about how they come out of this and how they increase their market share and how they improve their competitiveness. This means then that our governments right now should be looking at how do we make Canada one of the most digitized countries on earth? What can we do in terms of investing in our infrastructure system and in our logistics system to make sure that we're able to get our products to market, and we're able to source the materials that we need, and that we're able to have the training, the human skills, and in addition behind that, enable us to take advantage of how the world has changed. So this has been catalytic. What it has done is to accelerate trends that were already in place. But when we go out the other side of the tunnel, we're not going to look the same way as we did as we went into it.
Thanks, Perrin. And you alluded to this a bit in your answer there, as well as earlier when you spoke about the need for a mini budget from the government as soon as possible. Given obviously the severe economic disruption and loss of jobs that have been brought on by the pandemic, it's very crucial that Canada be extracting every ounce possible of growth and job creation out of every federal spending and policy decision that we see over the coming weeks and months. I've got one question. I'm also going to combine it with a question that I found here on Slido. My question is that broadly, trade and transportation infrastructure is a very, very small part of the federal infrastructure plan. I think it's the National Trade Corridors Fund is around 1.5% of federal infrastructure spending over the next decade. So my question is the government perhaps overlooking this kind of infrastructure, and are these the types of projects that we should be investing more in, pandemic or no pandemic? And then the question on Slido, which you can respond to as well, is if the federal government did one policy in the fall economic statement to help supply chains, what would that policy be? Again, thoughts on sort of more public investment in trade and transportation infrastructure, and any other sort of signature policy initiatives that you'd like to see from the government to support supply chains this fall. Who wants to take that first?
Happy to offer a few comments on that, Ryan. It's important. Government spending and support is important. We certainly understand that we also, as I mentioned, we take a lot of ownership in our own supply chain and control what we can and invest where we can. But trade enabling infrastructure and government spending and support is also very important to us, and it helps pay. Having support on that infrastructure, it's not a lot different than a hospital or playgrounds and transit. If we need the support there. And I will say that as good as we are, I talked about our brand being very high and being viewed as positive, dealing with the Canadian potash side, and that's a good brand and consistent, reliable around the world. But we can't get complacent with that. And infrastructure relates to our competitiveness to those who we're up against. And if I just would share a couple concerning trends that we need to be paying attention to here in Canada. According to the World Bank, Canada's logistic performance dropped from 10th place in 2007 to 20th place in 2018. And on international shipments, Canada went from 8th to 31st in the same period. Whereas I've mentioned my competitors, they're Russians, they're Belarusians, they're getting better, they're investing, they're improving at the same rate that we're declining. So as we grow our markets, and Canada is so important to the export side of things, to feed the growing global demand in sectors such as ours in potash or agriculture, but new trade agreements, a way we just need to capture those opportunities and look at it holistically as a country with support and infrastructure to deliver on that reliable, consistent promise that I've been really highlighting.
Thanks, Gord. Perrin, on trade infrastructure, any other sort of policy initiatives that you think would be worthwhile for the government to explore this fall?
Ryan, if we have one message to give to government, it's the need for focus. We are dealing with twin crises, one with public health, the other with our economic health. And as you know, in this town of Ottawa, I'm looking over at the Peace Tower, and the folks who work there have short attention spans. They have difficulty often focusing on key issues. We need to successfully navigate this public health crisis and to get our economy going again. On the economic side, this whole question of the infrastructure that we have and the investment in economic infrastructure is absolutely critical. In the same way as the pandemic has accelerated some trends in society like digitization, it's done other things. It has both demonstrated where our strengths lie as a country and where our weaknesses are as well. Among the strengths, unlike, say, our neighbors to the south, we have the capacity to work together and to take a Team Canada approach. We're not a society divided in the same way. We saw as well during the financial crisis that the stability of Canada's financial institutions, that's a real plus. But we've also seen other weaknesses, and that certainly includes in some areas of infrastructure, where we need to be very focused and ensure that we put money into trade-enhancing infrastructure. The other area where we have to move ahead is on telecommunications. I was very much involved at the time of SARS in businesses' response on that. If we had been faced with something on the scale of COVID at the time of SARS, our telecommunications infrastructure would have collapsed under the strain. We would not have been able to do what we've done today. We have a system that's much more robust. However, we need to push it well beyond where it is to roll out the infrastructure much more into rural and remote areas so that businesses in those areas and the families can take advantage of it. And we need to ensure that it's much more robust and dependable even than it is today. So let's be focused. Let's stick to the main event here. Let's look at taking what money the government has that's available and putting it into areas where we're going to have the biggest bang in terms of the economic return. And that means into this infrastructure.
Thanks, Perrin. I'm going to jump over to some questions now from the audience. Anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to ask one that they might want to, you can go to www.sli.do. Meeting code 2393, and you can ask a question or upvote one that's already been asked. So we'll go through a few of these in about the 25-30 minutes we have left here. So a question that from Tyler Hobson that goes all the way back to our original discussion, I think, on blockades, but also lends itself to other challenges sometimes we face in the rail sector. And Tyler asks, what are your thoughts on making rail transportation an essential service in Canada? Gord, you noted that many sectors were deemed essential have been named essential during the pandemic. So why don't we start with you, Gord?
Thanks, Tyler. Good question as well. And we 100% support rail as an essential service, same as our ports. I mentioned and touched on that we really there's no alternatives for us here from Saskatchewan, as you would well know. Moving that type of volume of our product to the port in a train, 205 car train, that's over 1,000 trucks on the road as an alternative, and that's our only option is trains, and this is essential. It's essential to our business. It's essential to the whole brand that I've been promoting about reputation and delivering what we can. So I'd love to see it. And, it's essential as anything that we do.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Ryan, when we talk about essential services, our thoughts turn to collective bargaining, and we at the Chamber certainly support collective bargaining, and we would far prefer that in any industry that business and labor be able to reach agreements themselves as opposed to having it imposed on them by government. But so if we can step aside from the terminology of essential service that means something in labor law and ask ourselves, is rail service in Canada essential? The answer is yes, and we certainly learned that from the blockades. And at the end of the day, the question that government has to ask itself is, where does the public interest lie? It is very clear when it comes to these critical elements of infrastructure that the public interest lies in being able to ensure that our economy remains open and that Canadians are able to remain at work and that they're able to get on with their lives without unreasonable disruption. And so whether it's ports or airports or railway transportation or a range of other areas, this infrastructure is critical.
Thanks, Perrin. Another question from Slido this one's for you, Gord. Given various issues on transportation, the questioner asks or states that we need more options. And the question to you is, do you see a future for the movement of potash through the recently reopened port of...
Sorry, Ryan, you broke up. Churchill, did you say?
If you see any opportunity for the future movement of potash through the port of Churchill.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry, you broke up there. You know, we've looked at that actually, Ryan. And I'm from Manitoba, so I'm certainly interested in optionality and other opportunities for Canpotex to explore. And we have looked at Churchill, and the challenge for us is the weight of our cars and the length of our train is too much for that port. So I'd love to see it, and I'd support it if it could make sense, but just from a supply chain and physical base, it's not a feasible option for us yet, but open if there's new solutions and technologies that change that view, but so far it hasn't worked.
Thanks, Gord. A question for you, Perrin, and you've talked about some of this, but I'll give you a chance to expand a little bit more. Just, more broadly, what is the Chamber doing to respond and engage with government to ensure that supply chains, and I would add, the business community and governments writ large are ready to respond and react to disruptions due to the term second wave, but the uptick in cases that we're seeing in various parts of the country over the last several weeks?
I'm sorry, Ryan, I had a bit of difficulty hearing that. What is government doing to prepare to ensure our supply chains can... Sorry.
And more specifically, what is the Chamber doing to work with governments to mitigate the impacts of sort of further closures and disruptions?
We're working very closely with government. It's extraordinary to me the degree of outreach there's been on the part of government. I've had more calls from the Prime Minister and from ministers in the last 6 months than in the previous 6 years. So there's a real desire on the part of government to take a Team Canada approach. It doesn't mean that we always agree that they always agree with the position that we take or that we always agree with what they do, but the lines of communication are certainly there. And we believe very firmly that there has to be a Team Canada approach, that everybody has to pull on the oars in the same direction, that we have common goals in terms of wanting to see the economy reopened safely, with the emphasis on safely, and to allow Canadians to get on with their ordinary lives safely, with an emphasis on safely, as rapidly as possible. And if you look at it, putting in simplest terms as to where business is at this point, we know that it has to be a business-led recovery. As long as business stays shuttered, the economy isn't going to rebound. We have to reopen businesses. We have to get people back to work. We have to have a strategy to allow us to do it safely. And we also know that for all of the assistance that's being provided by government and the checks that is written through all of this, those are essentially life preservers that help you to get to the other side of the river. These are because the economy is being shut down, but it doesn't restore our economic health. The only thing that will restore our economic health is when we can start reopening the economy again and safely get on with our ordinary lives. And that means that we need to have a coherent COVID management strategy to enable us to do that as quickly as possible. There is, Ryan, today a story that's moved on the wires that's been subsequently contradicted, saying that now that the government has approved rapid testing, that it may lift the 14-day quarantine for people flying into Canada and use rapid testing instead. That's being denied at the present time, last story that I saw. But that's an example. How do we intend to use these technologies to enable people to safely get on with their lives and to reopen commerce? We need to have a strategy to do that. Thanks,
Perrin. A quick sort of follow up on that to you, Gord, which is, what would it mean to a company like Canpotex if Canada were to have sort of rapid testing to get rid of the 14-day quarantine? As you alluded to, the fact that you've been able to conduct a lot of business with your customers virtually, but we could be again living as we are now for another year potentially, and at some point there may be the necessity for more face-to-face meetings and other events. What would having a better testing regime and the ability to do that mean for a company like yours?
Ryan, I agree with Perrin. It's huge. It's important that we get there and we get there quickly. To me, I understand safety and security of our people, of our teams, of our families. That's number one, no question. Never going to deny that, and never going to put anyone at risk. But when it comes to global business and travel, and yes, we've been able to manage effectively, and we're thankful for that. And I know other industries have been hurt significantly more than we have. But the fact is, I do think it's about managing the risk. And it's been effective with the 14-day quarantine, but COVID-19 is not going away. It's still here. And I'm not denying that was the right track and path. But for the future, as I think about opening up global trade, in particular with first, in North America here, rapid testing. Let's manage the risk. Test them on maybe both sides of the border, and at a minimum, it should reduce that 14 days. Whether it's instant, whether it's 48 hours, 24 hours, I'm not sure. But I think we need to get there, and we need to get there quickly, because this will not be going away when we turn the page on 2020. 2021, this is still a major issue for every industry, every business, especially the international ones that need to have some contact at times. So I support it.
Thanks, Gord. Something we've talked about a little bit, I'm going to turn to you here, Perrin, but I would like to build on a little bit more is, one of the strengths of our federation is obviously levels of government that are best equipped to respond to local circumstances. But one of our questioners on Slido points out that the variety of COVID restrictions somewhat feels haphazard and can be confusing, especially when news and social media and everything else so easily crosses borders. And it in many ways, the complexity of various COVID restrictions somewhat mirrors the interprovincial trade barriers that we see for companies that operate across different borders. Is there any opportunity to, again, starting with COVID, the idea that we're with this for a while, that we can start to, where it makes sense, try to align, make sure we're using more common language and eliminating some confusion for both companies and Canadians. And then sort of looking forward, could this create any momentum to start to tackle some of these interprovincial trade barriers as an economic growth mechanism?
Let me take it in two parts. First, COVID, the second, interprovincial barriers. As it relates to COVID, I think that description of the national response is generous. Our response, as you look across the country, the provincial, federal response, it's been in many ways incoherent. For supply chains operating across provincial boundaries, you would have different criteria used for whether a particular business was essential in one province as opposed to another. We talked earlier about regulations that are put on that vary so much from municipality to municipality. Yes, it is important for us to have the flexibility within the system to be able to respond to conditions on the ground in a particular region as they exist. That makes eminent sense to do that. but we need much better coordination and coherence than we've seen to date in terms of how we work together. My worry is, my political read at this point is that some of the consensus that we've had up until now is starting to fray. People are frustrated, whether politicians at the provincial level or in the federal government, and the public is, the level of frustration is growing to find us in a second wave at the present time. It may make it more difficult for us to have a coherent, integrated response over the next while than it's been up until now. I hope that's not the case. That's my worry. On the other hand, the good news is, as it relates to interprovincial barriers to trade, the feedback I get both from the federal government and from provincial governments is there's probably not been a better time for us to knock down some of these barriers. And there seems to be the political will to make this happen. So we should take advantage of that. This will unlock greater productivity in Canada and make us more competitive as a nation, and also increase choice for Canadians and increase opportunity for them.
Thanks, Perrin. I'm going to push back a little bit. You know, if I had a nickel for every time it was a great opportunity for Canada to eliminate interprovincial trade barriers, I'd probably be able to forego my chamber salary and retire at a young age. But, you know, I do agree now would be a terrific time to start to eliminate these. And I think there's a few premiers, to their credit, that have spoken more assertively about this than others in the past. But I still fear that we're going to get caught in the cycle of everybody violently agreeing. That's the business community, our provincial leaders, the federal government, that now's the time to move on these barriers. And then we'll get stuck in the same old static non-movement that we have for years past, and negotiations will fizzle out. A round of news stories will disappear. Maybe we'll get a joint news conference of some kind, but inevitably, you know, I fear we'll be back on another forum like this in 18 months or 2 years, talking about how now's the right time. You know, maybe I'm going to use that to ask a bit of a broader question to both of you, which is, the pandemic, it's tough to get governments to talk about growth in policies that lead to economic growth, as much as I think we in the business community would prefer it. And obviously, governments have other things on their mind, including what their constituents would like to hear, and often that involves the availability and success of certain government programs. How confident are you coming out of the economic disruption that's brought on, that we can get governments at all levels to focus a little more in on the question of policies that will drive economic growth? It might have been a little easier to ignore our pleas or our statements when growth was humming along at 2 or 2.5%. You know, obviously now we're not quite in the same situation. Do you both see an opportunity perhaps to change some of the conversation with governments coming out of this about sort of proactive policies that can generate growth and help Canada? Maybe let's start with you, Gord, and then we can go back to you, Perrin.
Thanks, Ryan. You know, and I share what you know your concern that, you know, we've heard it before, and it's not a new concept, and these are some of the challenges. But it is vital that we have a long-term plan between the private sector and government and coordinate that plan. For an example, for us here at Canpotex, just from that regard, you know, we're here in Saskatchewan, but our most valuable investments are in Vancouver, around our port. And so that's, you know, interprovincial for sure. As I think, you know, shifting that a little bit towards just overall policy from the government, I go back to where I started. Our reputation managers, what we do, and moving our product to market reliably is key. So any way we can reduce disruptions that affect our transportation system is where we have a lot of interest, and because it has a significant impact on our competitiveness in a global market. And it's not just COVID, it's winter, happens every year. It's labor disruptions, it's blockades, it's COVID. And all these issues aren't going away. Hopefully COVID does, but who knows what's next. But winter happens every year in Saskatchewan, and our service goes down every year at this time. And if the federal government can assist in helping us with policy to produce winter plans that that help us and our product arrive on time and safely, and provide resilience to that supply chain 12 months a year. Because, as I've said, reliability is key to our success and our brand going forward as well.
Thanks, Gord. Perrin?
Ryan, I'm having a hard time getting past the preface to your question earlier, where you mentioned that you would forego your salary at the chamber. You realize the impact this would have on our financial status. It really gives us an incentive to work on this issue. And we'll double down our efforts. It's true that in this town, when all is said and done, more is always said than done. And no topic is that more evident than on the issue of interprovincial barriers to trade. You have all sorts of meetings. Very little ends up coming of it at the end of the day, and next year there's another meeting. My sense is that there is a better opportunity this time, though, than there's been for a long while, and it's incumbent on the chamber, among others, to really press on this. In terms of the government's ability, or governments at all levels' ability to focus, what's impressed me is the common sense of Canadians. I've been watching the polling that has taken place most recently with regard to Canadians' priorities. They understand what the main event is. The main event is dealing with the public health crisis and then bringing our economy back to health again. And one thing that the politicians understand is the numbers. They perhaps don't understand budgetary numbers well, but they understand polling numbers. And what Canadians are saying to them right now is focus. We need to ensure that all of us are working together to ensure that we manage the crisis well and that we restore our economic health. And I am hopeful that that's a message that is being received by the politicians. Again, one of the areas in which I have to give them real credit is there's not, in my memory, there hasn't been better experience in terms of the amount of outreach taking place from government, of wanting to sit down with business and understand what's happening on the ground and to try to be helpful. That's something we can really build on, in my view.
Thanks, Perrin. We've got just around 15 minutes left here, and I've got a few more questions on Slido we can get to before we wrap up. One question here is, it says, do you feel there's a lack of visibility on how the federal government selects transportation and infrastructure projects it decides to invest in? I'm going to make a small amendment or addition to that question as well, which is, I think this infrastructure investment record is one it can and should be proud of. In recent decades, there's been significant public investments. However, a lot of those investments are not top-down, which suits many projects, but it is the federal government being a funder of the provinces that then works with the municipalities to identify, necessary local projects. But there isn't a lot of sort of Canada as a whole taken into consideration. We talked briefly before about the National Trade Corridors Fund. It's a small part of federal investment, but more broadly, a lot of these investments are done on a local or regional lens, and Canada doesn't, do things like Australia, where they have national structure investment lists where we can identify the top priorities. So I guess the first question is could there be more visibility in how the government selects these projects? But more broadly, are there some policy things that we could do so that Canada's taking a bit more of a top-down look at what some of our national infrastructure needs are? Obviously, Gordon, you guys avail yourself of a lot of this infrastructure and move product through all of our regions. So why don't we start with you?
Sure, Ryan, and it's another good question that I'm not going to have a quick, easy answer for. I certainly think it does make sense to have better transparency on the priorities, but I will say, there is no quick fix to the challenges we face, but a long-term plan is required for the future, and the strength of our reliability and resilience is a good first step. And I shared some of the stats that we can't be complacent. We are dropping relative to our competition, not just on potash. I believe that in many industries. So a longer term plan on infrastructure that we're aligned private sector and government, and bubble up those priorities, as you say, in a transparent way, that we can make the right decisions as a country and as a team to help us maintain that competitiveness globally, because nobody else is slowing down either. They're continuing to raise the bar and get better. I do like to give us credit, though, that Canada, no matter your business, has a great reputation globally. And it's something that we need to continue to build on as a competitive advantage. I truly believe that. And part of that is our supply chain and our infrastructure.
Thanks, Gordon. Perrin.
Yes, we definitely do need to have more transparency in terms of how are these decisions made, what are the priorities, and what can we expect. We are a federation, and it is important for us to be sensitive to the needs of the provinces and the priorities that local governments have. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that Canada is more than the sum of the parts. And there's a temptation when politicians are looking at large amounts of money being made available for infrastructure, for them to simply spread the money like peanut butter across the country. And it tends to be judged on how much did my region, or how much my municipality, or how much did my sector get, as opposed to what is in fact the impact that this is going to have. How does this affect the common good? And what we need to do is to be more strategic. The simple fact is we have a major infrastructure deficit in Canada. We've been spending infrastructure more than we've been spending on infrastructure for the last few decades, and we need to invest now. We don't have all the money that we need to have, so we need to do triage. We can't fund every project, so we need to fund the ones that are going to have the greatest impact. And this is why funding infrastructure that is critical for enhancing our trade is an essential part of that and has to be given a priority, and why we have to see our transportation and logistics sector in Canada as something that's organic, that extends across the whole country, rather than seeing just its local manifestations.
Thanks, Perrin. Okay, I'm going to get us close to a wrap up here with a final question, which is, it's been, we've talked about it a few times, but it's been really quite the year in 2020. I'd like maybe both of you just to take a moment to reflect on any lessons that you've learned, specifically any maybe that you haven't already shared with us over the last hour plus. And maybe with the benefit of hindsight, what is something that you might have done differently in 2020? And I would say differently other than maybe investing in Amazon and Netflix stock or anything like that. Why don't we start with you, Gordon?
Thanks, Ryan. And yeah, it is amazing the year that we've had. And I mentioned at the onset, having joined Canpotex, it was January 17th, 2020. It was a different world back then. And I guess lessons learned, so being new to Canpotex, but certainly familiar with the organization from my Mosaic days. In hindsight, and it's what I'm really proud of, is just the solid foundation we have here at Canpotex to handle something like a pandemic that was thrust upon us fairly quickly in March. And I've touched on a number of the points, but our long history, 48 years, strong customer relations, it really is a competitive advantage of us and for us. And we've been able to leverage that going to a new world, a digital world, connecting with our customers and continuing the business in a way that's even exceeding what we anticipated at the start back in January. We've also got some optionality within our supply chain built in within that strong foundation, giving us some flexibility to move product depending on weather or blockades or just keep, we have 3 ports that we use. It's never enough optionality, but it helps. And the other thing with the team here in Canpotex is, as I've mentioned, we face new challenges every day, and we have through the pandemic in 2020. And the team, rather than harp on your challenges and your issues, they've been right on top of solutions. And so I'm proud of that. And can't not mention safety at a time of a global pandemic, and we've got shared values with our shareholders on safety, and we share notes, and the fact that we've been able to operate as safely as we have through this situation is another lesson that I'm extremely proud of. And we have made technological investments to be able to operate in business as usual, even though 90% of our workforce have been working from home since March 13th. And that technology in place has helped us excel through this. So it's more the hindsight of the foundation that we've had on the business that we've built has enabled us to execute in a way that I'm extremely proud of. So anything we would have done differently, gosh, that's I agree, Ryan, buy some of those stocks for sure. And we're learning as we go, and you don't always make the best decisions, but learn from those decisions and apply it to the future. And as I said earlier in the call, I think there's some positive coming from this that we're learning that we can apply to the future to make Canpotex, Canadian businesses even better in the future. I'll leave it there.
Gord. Perrin, what about you? What have you learned this year, and anything that you might have done differently in hindsight?
Lots. Ryan, I'm really proud of you and of all of our colleagues at the Chamber for what the Chamber's achieved during the pandemic. But if we knew at the start of this what we know now, there are many ways in which we would have acted differently. We're all generals to an extent who fight the last war. And I was through two epidemics or pandemics previously. One was SARS. The other was when I was Minister of Health. It was the AIDS epidemic in the early stages, which we thought were simply going to sweep the world. And you tend to base what you do on the experience that you've had. So as we saw the developments taking place in China, and then to a later extent in northern Italy, it was clear that we had something coming toward us that was very significant. We didn't know exactly what it was, but we knew that we had to prepare. I anticipated at that point that it would be something worse than SARS, but I certainly didn't anticipate that you would see the whole of the global economy shut down in the way that's been seen, international travel come to a halt, see the Canadian border closed. I don't think any of us anticipated that. Had we would have, sorry, we have a window washer who is just slipping down the side here and wants to be recognized. We focused initially, particularly on SMEs and what could be done to ensure that SMEs had business continuity plans. If we realized that the whole of the economy was going to be shut down the way it was, we would have been pressing governments to move much more quickly, to take a much more holistic approach in dealing with this, and to get assistance programs out earlier, to react earlier, to take necessary measures to protect public health, and to encourage collaboration. What do we need to do now? We need to do what, I'm a former defense minister. The military, after any operation, does a postmortem. And the goal isn't to assign blame. It's to pull back, look at what happened, and ask themselves, what are the lessons learned? What lessons can we draw from this that will allow us to prepare better for the next time? That's what we need to do at this point, too. I believe that there should be a group set up at arm's length to government to take a look at what we did right, what we did wrong, the goal not to assign blame, but to look at what we could do better and what we need to do to prepare for crises in the future. The one thing that we know for sure is that it doesn't end with this. There will be more pandemics. There will be climate crises. There will be terrorism. There will be other instances. And this is a very good time for us to take stock and ask ourselves how we can prepare better.
Thanks, Perrin. I think that's a really great note to wrap up on. And I really appreciate you, Gord, for joining us and sharing your reflections on what's been a very eventful first year for you at Canpotex. You talked about the significant investments that you're making in rail cars. We touched on your experience with the blockades, how you've been managing and the organization has been managing through COVID while still providing that consistent, reliable, and safe
Yes.
Investments for your customers. And Perrin, thank you for sharing your insights. And thanks everybody on the line who's taken the time to join us, to ask your questions, to listen in. I see a number of associations and companies and exceptional organizations that have been serving their members and their customers very well throughout this, and we're pleased anytime that they take time out of their day to join us at the Chamber. One minor sort of housekeeping note before we wrap up as well is if you listened in and enjoyed this, the Chamber has another event, the Western Executive Summit, coming up at the end of November, on November 24th. It's a full day session where we've got, Perrin has a fireside chat with the President of the Treasury Board, Minister Duclos. We've also got some really great panel discussions on how we can harness Canada's tax system for recovery, how we can do the same with our regulatory systems to promote long-term growth. And we're also going to have another discussion on some of what we've talked about here today with trade and transportation infrastructure. So if you'd like to attend that event, please follow up with us at the Chamber, or you can do a quick Google to find the registration info. Thank you again, Gord. Thank you to Canpotex for supporting this event and making this webinar possible, and your partnership is incredibly valued by all of us out here at the Chamber.